Well, it turns out that it's all gone wrong on the first time I tried it. Hey ho. My webcam has just decided to stop at exactly the moment I joined in. So there you go. Well, that's what happens when you try new things out. Let's see if I can connect my proper camera. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Boom. Anyway, welcome to A Tippling Philosopher. Hopefully that's a slightly better picture for you. Not that you want to see me any the clearer. This is the first live stream I've ever done, and I thank so far the 4 people for tuning in to see how it goes. I played a little bit of an intro there, and it looked like it really lagged, so that's something to think about. I don't know. Hey ho! I'm new to all this. It'll get better. Whatever. I also want to say thanks for all your support, all the people who do watch. Hello from Australia. Awesome. Thank you so much for all the support I do get from you, both here and on my blog and on you on Facebook and everywhere. So that's really good. And I also want to say, please check out the interview I did yesterday with David Fletcher. He's author of this fantastic book that we talked about, Myth Education. I banged on about that lots yesterday. It is a wonderful book full of, beautiful artwork concerning gods and goddesses from around the world. And the interview is great fun. I'm having loads of fun actually doing interviews at the moment. I think it's just an enjoyable thing to get to interact with other thinkers and other people who have a lot to say, and to hopefully bring out the best in them. So that's been a real joy. Please check it out. Please check out all the interviews I've done. Today's little chat, because it's only going to be a sort of 10-minute chat, 10-15-minute chat but today I want to talk about abortion. And why I want to talk about abortion is because it's a really divisive topic, and it's a topic that Christians in particular have great opinions about. Very strong opinions. Great is the wrong word. Very strong opinions about. Really visceral opinions, and they claim to be pro-life. Pro-life is a term I'm trying to stop using, and I'm trying to use anti-choice. Because I don't think they're pro-life at all. I think that they are very anti-life after that baby has been born. So I think they're pro-birth, and they are not pro-life, because as soon as that baby is born, they don't really care. They're not supportive. They're not into thank you so much for those kind comments, by the way. They're not really into supporting the children through welfare. You can bet your bottom dollar that, particularly in America, and I'm being quite American-centric here, US-centric, but particularly in America, you'll have your real pro-life, anti-choice advocates who will then not advocate for strong security blankets of a very, very strong social welfare system. And so you get a real kind of tension with supposedly being pro-life, but as soon as that life starts, they give up caring. And I think that's a real problem. But this argument concerns God, and not Christians per se, but should be really problematic for Christians. So the argument I'm going to present here is that God loves abortion, or it seems necessary for fetuses to die for a greater good to come about. Because that's certainly one of the conclusions you really have to draw from looking at the statistics for natural, spontaneous abortions. So natural abortions sometimes, when they're later on in pregnancy, get termed as miscarriages. But earlier on, their spontaneous natural abortions are something that God has the power to stop, but was also seemingly designed into the system in the first place. So, if God has sovereign responsibility and ultimate power, and designed everything that came to be, then why is it that there are so many natural abortions? It's a real problem, and statistics for miscarriages and natural abortions are they are notoriously difficult to assess really, really accurately, mainly due to so many of them taking place without the mother even knowing about them. So statistically, it means that anywhere up to as many as 75% of all pregnancies, and by pregnancy I mean a fertilized egg, that the egg is fertilized, then what happens? 75 up to 75%, and it's really difficult to get an accurate idea of that, end up dying or ceasing to exist. It's a staggering number of pregnancy losses. For example, it's estimated that 3 out of 4 eggs that are fertilized do not fuse their DNA correctly, and therefore either do not attempt to implant or fail at implantation. And this means that hey, you could have as many as 50 million non-viable fertilized eggs, and blastocysts, and then embryos, fetuses. You're failing. Up to 50 million in the US alone. Now, it might not be 50 million. It might be 25 million. It might be 1 million, right? I could be really, really inaccurate with my statistics here. But even if I was absurdly conservative and said there were 1 million, that's 1 million fertilized eggs that Christians generally claim are human beings at conception. I mean, that's a huge problem because you don't get personhood at conception. I could bore you with loads of arguments to do with that, but today's not for that. Say you get 1 million deaths a year, 1 million fertilized eggs dying a year. In reality, I would argue it's more nearer 50 million, but that is incredible. And God has the power to stop that, but God doesn't stop that. And the problem is kind of twofold. Firstly, for people who critique abortion on the grounds that they are supposedly pro-life, this kind of makes a mockery of the arguments. And secondly, it makes God look like a really callous entity. Okay, so God is supposedly omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, all-loving, which means if there's any pain and suffering in the world, God is powerful enough to do something about it, knows what to do about it, and cares enough to want to do something about it. So why is it that there are so many fetal deaths, miscarriages, failed implantations, failed blastocysts? Why are there so many that exist, not just in the US, but around the world, every single day? And not just every single day right now, but over time, since the beginning of humanity. I mean, we are talking arguably billions and billions of lives, potential lives, lost due to God's design and failure to step in to do anything about it. Now, there's an interesting difference between omissive or permissive will and active will. So think about a tsunami, for example. The tsunami of 2004, where 230,000 people or so died, and animals and all sorts of stuff, right? You could argue that God didn't make that tsunami happen, although that's bizarre because God designed the world in order that there is plate tectonics. So kind of God did design that to happen. But imagine you want to forget that a little bit. You're trying to be charitable to the Christian, or you're trying to be Christian yourself. You say, no, God didn't make that happen in order that he wasn't murdering those 230,000 people. Okay. But it happened, and God did nothing to stop it. Okay, so rather than God making that tsunami happen, God allowed it to happen. And that is functionally the same. So God still in this situation could have done something about it, but chose not to do something about it. In other words, that tsunami is providing a service for God. And that sounds really bizarre, but the death of that 240,000, 230,000 people and all those animals and all the pain and suffering it brought with it is providing some service to God, because he didn't stop it from happening, which means usually there's seen as a theodicy, which is a kind of defense of why they're suffering in the world, which is that a greater good comes about. Okay, so God allows that, or designs and makes that tsunami happen so that a greater good comes about. Okay, now let's take that back to the abortion argument, the natural abortion argument, where you have 1 million, 25 million, 50 million American fetal blastocyst fertilized egg deaths every year. You have to say, as a Christian who believes in omni God, you have to say there is a greater good that comes about from that happening, and that, of course, it means you get into real problems here. I'm just going to look at some of the comments that are coming in here. Thank you so much for commenting. It seems that God has a policy of choosing some pregnancies over to continue that kills a mother. That's really interesting. So, and in fact, you can take that a couple of steps further in different directions. So, God chooses which children are viable and survive and which die. Where I say children, I'm talking about blastocysts or embryos, fetuses, so on and so forth. So there is a situation where he chooses. So he allowed Hitler to live, but there are millions of others every year that he decides aren't worthy of living. So that's interesting. So Hitler can come to be, but so many other people who would surely have been far nicer human beings aren't allowed to come to be. Okay, that's interesting. Then, as Old Before My Time says, he allows certain ones of these pregnancies to kill the mother. And you got two situations going on there. You got spontaneous abortions, or where the fetus dies and the mother dies, or where the fetus survives and the mother dies. So you got these situations where God is allowing, apparently, all these millions of fetuses and fertilized eggs to die, or certain situations where he allows them to survive but the mother to die, or certain situations where they both die. And every time you get this pain and suffering, you have to say, if you're a Christian believing in the Omni God, there is a greater good that comes about from this. And it gets rather problematic. So thank you for that. That's a really good point. Other great quotes coming in. Being brought up as a Jehovah's Witness, any question you had asking why does this happen and that happen, etc., the answer has to be it will be all perfect in the new system after Armageddon. Right. This is a really good point. So this is interesting. I'm doing a live that's obviously going to be a bit longer because there's such good points coming up. I love this. Thank you so much. So I've written about this before in terms of heaven, whether you call this a new system after the Armageddon, or whether you call it heaven, or whether you call it whatever. This promissory note of something greater is not moral justification. This is compensation. Okay. So for example, if this is Matt Stan saying this. So if I walked up to Matt and punched Matt full in the face, I punched him in the face and broke his jaw. I wouldn't do that, Matt. I think I'm quite a nice guy. But if I did, punch you in the face, broke your jaw, right? That's a morally heinous thing to do. Then I gave you £10,000 afterwards, or $10,000 afterwards, and say, there you go, there's compensation. Or the courts maybe pay you compensation. The courts maybe pay you compensation for having broken your jaw. That compensation does not now mean my punching you in the face is morally good. What it does is it says that is morally bad, but you are going to get compensation for that to try and balance the books and make you feel a bit better. But it doesn't make what I did good. The only way you can that becomes a good action. The only way that me punching you in the face and breaking your jaw becomes good by that kind of compensation is if you believe in a really strict moral consequentialism, which means that the morality of any action is evaluated on the outcome that it brings. Of course, the initial outcome is breaking your jaw. A further outcome later down the line is that you get $10,000. You could argue, depending on how you calculate your moral consequentialism and how far into the future the consequences of that action can be calculated, you could say that is a good action. The problem is Christians hate moral consequentialism because you don't need God for it, right? So if you're a Christian or a Jehovah's Witness in this case, saying that it's all fine because it'll be made better in the new system that comes about, that isn't moral justification. That is compensation. And that's a really important distinction because it doesn't make all the terrible things that happen on earth good. It means they're still bad, but hey, I'm going to compensate you for that later. And that's a really, really important distinction. Thanks for saying that. It's a really great point, and it's a really common point. And I would just say you shouldn't let Christians get away with that. If they say, for example, the common iteration of this is by talking about like a 6-month-old baby that gets cancer and dies. And people go, oh, it's fine. It'll live in heaven for eternity. And you say, oh, that sounds lovely. But you're still doing compensation and not justification. It doesn't justify the death of that baby. Or in this case, I would say God murdering that baby because God designed cancer. God could stop that happening. God has sovereign power over everything and allowed that to take place. So I would say that's pretty much still the equivalence of murder. So there you go. So many great comments. Alan Owens, great. This is brilliant. I'm going to have to show this. But of course, what this does, Alan is presenting a kind of moral consequentialism, which is to say, I don't mind you punching me in the face if the outcome is me getting £10,000. And that's fine. I can allow that to be a moral system, value system, but as long as you understand that it's moral consequentialism, which is essentially secular, and you have no need for God. And we can still argue on the details of that because certain moral consequentialisms, that is still not good. Certain moral consequentialisms that can still be calculated as good. There are so many different variations of moral consequentialism and utilitarianism that it gets very tricky to just say consequentialism and it be this one thing. You can't really say that. It pertains to lots of different moralities. But absolutely, Alan, I'll tell you what. Well, no, I can't unfortunately do that for you because I don't have 10 grand to share with you. But there you go. So what we have is that God is supposedly omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, and yet there are millions of fetal deaths a year that God has designed into the system. God is permitting the deaths of, and yet that's ignored ostensibly by Christians. And really, they've only got two kind of options. One is skeptical theism, which is God moves in mysterious ways. Yeah, there might be a reason. And this comes on to something called the logical problem of evil. The problem of evil is, why is there so much suffering on earth given the omni, omni, omni? And skeptical theism says, the logical problem of evil says it's not logically incompatible that there is this omni God and there is suffering. There might be a reason for any suffering. The problem is you can take that to the nth degree. You can say there's all this incredible suffering. You can be the last person on earth and everyone's been tortured and killed for the last 50 years, including your family and children and everything. There's nothing left alive on earth, but Alan Owen is the last person alive, and God is torturing Alan for 50 years, and Alan can still say it is not logically incompatible that omni-God still exists and all this suffering exists, there could still logically be a reason why everyone's been tortured and killed, and I've been tortured for 50 years and I'm the last person alive. And it's right, there could be a reason. I can't think of that reason, but it's not logically impossible. But that's all the Christian has to go to, which is this kind of possibility ergo probability. It's possible, therefore it's probable. It could be that there's a reason, therefore there is a reason. And that's a really problematic move, and I don't like it at all. So I think those kind of moves towards skeptical theism, which is we don't know the mind of God, but there could be a reason, it is problematic. John Loftus, when talking about this sort of problem, calls it or has called it the omniscience escape clause, where he says, quote, "We've heard this escape clause so many times before. My ways are not your ways. An ancient superstitious canonized biblical text says of God. How do we know what an omniscient God might do?" An apologist chimes in. "It could be how God purportedly communicated to us in ways that are indistinguishable from anything else we see in the ancient world, or the tragedy of the Haitian earthquake, or a child suffering and soon to die from leukemia. How can we judge an omniscient God's ways?" we're asked over and over, with an implied "we can't." The answer is obvious. We must be able to understand enough of God's ways to know that his ways are good and that he knows what he's doing. It's that simple. If God does not act as a loving person would do, then all we can reasonably conclude is that God is not acting like a loving person would do. And if God does not respond in discernible loving ways, then tragic events take place. Then it looks entirely as if tragic events happen randomly without his ever watchful eye. Okay, so that's it. That's the omniscience escape clause. It's like, yeah, but and this is what Alan, not Alan, Old Before My Time has just said. It's almost as if it's all made up. What does it really look like when you have a tsunami of 230,000 people dying and all the animal and ecosystem deaths, and you have 50 million, 75 million, however many million US fetal miscarriages and deaths every year? What does it look like? Does it look like naturalism? Or does it look like an all-loving God? Because prima facie, in a really obvious way, you know, unless you're going to... Oops. So unless you're going to get your knickers in a twist and start trying to think ways around that, then oh, I love a bit of StreamYard giving me hassle. Ugh. That was brilliant, because I actually just gave you just the diamond. I disproved God in the last like 2 minutes, and it was beautiful. And then suddenly God popped into non-existence. Damn it. So what I was saying there is that I do not I cannot go through life thinking that God has got a reason, some reason that we just don't know why all this suffering could exist, why 230,000 people could die in a tsunami, and there might be a reason why that happened. There could be a greater good. That's not good enough for me. Like, if I, as an intelligent human being, can't discern what that greater good is, if God can't come down and tell me what that greater good is, that's not good enough. I'm not going to go on faith, because it looks really, really, really positively like God doesn't exist. That's what it looks like. You know, this prima facie interpretation of all this death and suffering, of the fetal deaths to the millions every year in every country, tsunamis, earthquakes, natural death, natural evil. It's just, it's not good enough. It's not good enough. So I'd be interested to see what you think, you know, classic Christian defenses are, because to me, it just looks like skeptical theism, really. God moves in mysterious ways. And within that there is a greater good that comes out, but that we just don't know what the greater good is. Or I suppose the only other thing a Christian could say is that these fetal deaths don't take place. With the ones we don't know about, literally God like disappears them. But then it's like, yeah, but then all the ones we do find out about, and all the miscarriages that do happen, they happen. We definitely know they happen. I don't know. I don't know that the Christian has many options here other than skeptical theism. And that's why so many arguments about God come down to arguments about morality, which then boil down to arguments about the problem of evil. And really, the problem of evil is the big argument about whether God exists or not. So there you go. That's God appears to love abortions because he has designed into the system and sanctions and does nothing about the millions and millions upon millions of fetal blastocysts and fertilized egg deaths every year that happen naturally. There you go, Christian. How do you deal with that? Deal with the numbers, because if you're happy to go on the side of the road and protest about, you know, abortions and at abortion clinics, then you also need to have a really good understanding of, you know, the fact that your God appears to do this, but do it on a scale that dwarfs what you're protesting about. Absolutely dwarfs what you're protesting about. And sorry, the other thing, so skeptical theism is one defense. The other defense I do see is that God has the right to do this. I have a real problem with this argument. God has sovereign responsibility and is sovereign in general over all of creation. So if God wants to kill people, then God can. God has the right. I'm like, whoa, I don't know. I'm not sure that I go along with that. And even if I did go along with that, it doesn't make it good, right? Just because you have the right to do something, it doesn't mean you should do something. This idea that God has the right to kill that which he has created. Imagine you're a lab scientist and you create in the lab sentient life form. And that sentient life form, you create hundreds of them, thousands of them, doesn't matter, or one of them. You are fully responsible for creating this sentient life form. However, this sentient life form is now living and feeling and existing. Just because you have created that sentient life form, imagine I literally did this, created some test tube baby, right? I created this sentient life form from nothing, and it comes to grow and turns into an adult, and then I just get a gun out and shoot the adult. Like, yeah, well, I created it. Like, okay, does that really give you the right to kill it? And if it does give you the right to kill it, does it make it morally right that you did kill it? So the right for God's right to kill, to take life as much as it is to give it, I think is a thoroughly problematic issue. And as Matt says, where is the love? A really good point, because man, how often do we hear this? God is love. God is love. God is love. Is God love? I mean, really, is God love? And I talked to, I did, you guys who are watching now might probably have seen it already, but I did a couple of videos on, well, what does that look like? How is God love? If God is an abstract entity, an abstract idea outside of material existence that appears to be omni, 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 which means God is constrained to only being able to do that which is all loving within the confines of knowing his own future. So he can't do anything other than he must do because he's predicted his own future by knowing about the future, divine foreknowledge. So he knows what's going to come to pass. He cannot act against his own predictions because that would make his foreknowledge infallible. So God can only do one thing going forward. God is a divine robot. Okay, I don't see any way out of this. There is no way out of this. I've never seen any comeback from this argument. So if God is a divine robot that is abstract, doesn't have any physical dimensions, apart from when incarnated as Jesus, and can't have any kind of foibles, any imperfections, is just some kind of perfect algorithm. How can I love that? How can I love that? How can I enter into a relationship with that? What Christians do is they anthropomorphize God to become their invisible best friend. That's not what God is. God can't be that. So I just, yeah, God is love. Real problem there. So Brad Kemble says, so there is no here. So there is no more death. It is God, just God murdering. I'm not quite sure about that question. I will interpret it like this. If God allows, so let's talk about the tsunami or the embryonic deaths again. If God allows that to take place, but has also designed the system in which that takes place and foreknowingly knows it will take place. So you've got to marry up the design with the foreknowledge here. So if God is designing and counterfactual knowledge means if this happens, then that happens. So you can have a million different universes that God could create, and God has a full knowledge of what would happen in every one of those universes, even if he doesn't create those universes. If I created this universe, this would happen in it. I'm not going to create that universe, but I have knowledge, counterfactual knowledge about what would take place. So I have all this knowledge of what would happen in all these different scenarios, and I create this one. This world that we all live in now. God has created it, but he's designed it and knows what will come about. I've designed it in this way that on this particular date, I know 100% that 230,000 people will die in a tsunami. I'm not going to change anything about the design. So therefore, there must be something about this design or something about the event itself that is good or offers a service that brings about a greater good necessarily. These 230,000 people will die. God does nothing about it. God allows that to happen. He designs it, creates it, sets everything in motion. It happens, does nothing about it. I think it's functionally the same as God murdering. I think that is functionally the same to me as God creating those people in order that they die. God could have not created them. He could have had the same world, but all those 230,000 people, he just didn't exist. Maybe he allowed those fetal deaths to take place. Or he took those people and just moved them to a safe place or whatever. God could have done anything, loads of miracles or creative, being really creative with his creation, such that didn't take place. But it took place. And I think the only way I would interpret that is that effectively God is murdering them. God is creating them in order to die in that situation. And he has full power over whether they die or not. And the creation that he made killed them. Plate tectonics killed them. And he knowingly. So I don't know. Can I think of an analogy? I work in a factory. I've designed the factory. I've built the factory. Right. And I know today that a machine will break at 6 o'clock tonight, and I know there are going to be 100 people in the factory, and I know that machine will blow the factory up. I know that. I didn't, maybe, well, if I made the machine in order that it blew up, then it's even more problematic, which is God. if I made it, so if I designed and created this factory and it was going to blow up and kill those people and I did nothing about it, a court of law, I would be done. Would I be done for murder? Manslaughter? I don't know. I don't know the law enough, but it's bad. I know that whether it's murder or manslaughter or whatever, I should be held accountable as a CEO and designer and of that factory and the boss of that factory. I should be held accountable. I'd expect to be taken to court. I'd expect to go to prison. God has moral culpability because God has ultimate responsibility and full design responsibility and you know, I don't know. It's just, I don't know how Christians go through life getting God off the hook at every single opportunity. I do know because God provides a psychological function for them that is more powerful than the problems they come across or more useful to them, so that they end up burying those problems. I mean, you guys are commenting will probably know more than I do because you've probably been more committed adult Christians. I was never an adult Christian particularly. I'd sort of shelved my belief around about 17, 18 probably. But you guys would know, like, how did you deal with all these problems psychologically? Was there cognitive dissonance going on? Did you just justify not knowing, but with all the good stuff that you're promised about the religion, or the good things that the religion does for you in terms of social, the social rewards you get from it, the emotional rewards? I don't know. You guys can maybe furnish me with some ideas there. So Matt Stan says, I was taught that God would stop earthquakes. How? By stopping plate tectonics. God would stop, but God doesn't stop. Why doesn't God stop earthquakes? Because they have to be necessary for a greater good to come about. And let's unpick that a little bit. When we say it's necessary for a greater good to come about, what we're saying is there's no other way in existence that you could get whatever it is you want, that greater good. And again, we don't even know what that is. So you've got 230,000 people dying in tsunami, or all those fetal deaths in spontaneous abortions, all dying. And the Christian has to say there's a theodicy here, which means a greater good comes about. Okay, let's think about this greater good. So if that's so important, is there no other way you could get that greater good to come about than with 75 million annual fetal deaths in America alone, or 230,000 people dying in a tsunami? Is there no other way? Maybe could you not get that greater good with only 220,000 people dying in a tsunami? Could you not get, so it's that amount of death and suffering is necessary, not one death less. Because if you could get that greater good with one death less, an all-loving God would bring about that greater good with one death less. Or what about one death less than that? So on and so forth. So that has to be the optimal amount of suffering, the necessary amount of suffering to bring about whatever greater good there is. And of course, that just melts your brain because it's obviously nonsense. I can't think of any greater good that would necessitate exactly 230,000 people dying. It's just bonkers. There you go. Maybe God is being kind. Maybe all the fetuses are future atheists and would ultimately end up in hell. Really good point, because actually this is the divine hiddenness argument, or a certain iteration of it. This is the how is it that there were Amazonian tribes people existing in 5000 BCE, right? Let's imagine 5000 BCE, before the Hebrew Bible was written, before the revelation of Jesus and all this stuff. You've got people living in the Amazon rainforest. People like William Lane Craig say, well, their way of justifying that is saying that these are souls that would have freely rejected God. So what God does is front loads those souls into people who would never have a chance of accessing God's revelation anyway. And it's like, really? So all these people were people who would have freely rejected God. Well, why did you create them anyway? You've got, again, it comes back to you've got the power of creating these people or not. Counterfactual knowledge. If you know, I know that if I create this soul, they will freely reject me. Don't create the soul. Instead, you're going to create them to go through pain and suffering. And then if you believe in hell, you're going to punish them in hell eternally. It's utterly absurd and morally reprehensible. Interesting. I think, was it Richard Dawkins and who else? Someone else did try to sue the Vatican over the child abuse that was taking place, I think, in America, and they were unable to because they are seen as a nation. If you've seen my interview with Gary McClelland, who's the chief exec of Humanist International, go and watch that interview. It's a fabulous interview, really, really good interview. But he talks about the fact that they couldn't touch the Vatican because they are a nation and they have a sort of diplomatic immunity. It's a real problem. You can't sue them. Again, God did make plate tectonics. Again, it all comes down to, it's really hard to get God off the hook when God has designed and created everything in existence. So there you go. So even the human initiated terminations must be God's will due to wow, that's fascinating. Do you know what? I don't know that I've ever thought about that. And that's a really good point, because of course God could stop that. God could stop that by stopping those people from changing their brain circuitry to make the other decision. So they still think they made that decision freely. So it's not like God trips them up on the way to the abortion clinic, or God gets them run over by a bus, or whatever, assuming that's the man. I was projecting then. The woman, you wouldn't want her being run over by the bus because she's pregnant. But maybe flipping her mind, and they'd never know. But God doesn't do that. So God has the power to do things, but doesn't do it. Therefore, even their terminations, of course, because there can be no gratuitous suffering. There cannot even be a stubbed toe's worth of gratuitous suffering in the world because of God's omni characteristics. Therefore, even the deaths that come about from humans deciding to abort fetuses, God has some kind of moral culpability in there, because he could have stopped it but didn't. Imagine I see like a 12-year-old boy who I could easily overcome, right, beating up and mugging a granny on the other side of the road, right? I walk past them even. If I have the power to stop that boy from beating up that granny and mugging her, but I choose not to for some weird reason, that casts moral aspersions on me. Like, that's morally bad of me if I had the power to do something but didn't. If God has the power to stop actual human abortions but doesn't, human chosen abortions but doesn't, then although the humans have some kind of culpability there as well, on the Christian worldview, God also does as well. That's a really, really good point. Love it. This is what I think every day. This is why I do what I do. It's insane. How can they not see it? How can they not see it? But I think what happens a lot is that people get what I try and do with all my writing and my blogging and my books, my blogging and this channel is to try and marry loads of different disciplines, which is, say, a bit of theology, a bit of biblical exegesis, a bit of history, but a bit of philosophy and psychology as well. And you need to do all of those things to have a really complete case, because what some apologists do is they bury themselves in biblical exegesis, but they don't also think about, well, let's think about classical theism and an omni God, and let's think about how that looks if I take it right back to the beginning. I'm just going to spend my life in here and doing all this very detailed stuff to do with whether, this gospel makes sense with that gospel and Paul and this and that, and do a whole load of biblical theology and exegesis, but I'm not going to consider the larger philosophy back here and the all the other stuff. So for me, it's all about marrying all of these things up to say you shouldn't be doing this here until you work this stuff out here. So, for example, if I was to debate William Lane Craig, I've often said I would debate him on free will, because people argue about God and stuff, and I've done a video on this about God and stuff and all this stuff over here. But if they believe in a personal judgmental God and we don't have free will, then this is all irrelevant, because the personal judgmental God makes no sense, given that we don't have free will. So I would go to William Lane Craig. We, William and myself, need to argue about free will first before we argue about anything else. So I think there are certain arguments upon which all these other arguments kind of depend, and unless you sort them out first, these are all kind of irrelevant. I mean, I like to argue about all of them, right? But you know, in the debate, I would go for the free will argument first. Craig, if you can't establish free will coherently, none of the other stuff makes any sense. And it's like what I do in my resurrection book, which is, if you can't establish atonement and you can't establish the Holy Trinity, the resurrection story is nonsense. It depends on the atonement and the Trinity. You do that first, and then we can talk about the resurrection. Don't put your head in the book and talk about how harmonizing this gospel with that gospel and spending 30 years trying to work that out if atonement doesn't make sense. Because if atonement doesn't make sense, the resurrection, there's no reason for the resurrection, or there's no reason for the death of Jesus. So on and so forth. So yeah, I don't know. I'm ranting now. It is so insane, but as Matt also says, religion's hold is bloody strong. Indoctrination is too dang good, unfortunately. It's why psychology is so important in understanding religion. So it's often not about the content of religion as to why people believe. It's the psychological reasons why they believe. And if you don't understand the psychological reasons, you can't convince them out of their position, because you're arguing with the content, and actually that's not why they got into the position in the first place, I would argue. So it's really important that we do psychology along with philosophy. So let's have a look at this question. Why did God give us the ability to cause, invent, even think of abortion if he is so against it? There is no intellectually honest answer. That's a really interesting question. Why would God put in the tree? If anyone's had kids here, right? You say to your kids, I've put that ball in the middle of the lawn. Can you not kick it, please? Please don't kick the ball. The first thing your kids are going to do, any human does this, is like, I've got to kick the ball. That's the first thought. It's like, I'm going to kick it. So why would you put the tree of, of knowledge and of good and evil in the garden and then say, oh, please don't eat from that, and then walk away as if you're never going to see anything? And then why would you put or allow there to be a talking serpent that's going to tempt them? And you know it's going to happen anyway. You've got divine foreknowledge, so you know all this is going to happen. You still put the tree there, and you still allow the serpent to be there. God has utter moral culpability for the fall of humanity, if you believe in original sin. Utterly culpable. He's designed us. He's designed the Garden of Eden. He's knowingly put the tree of knowledge of good and evil there, and he's put the talking serpent there. None of it makes sense. Are there any other questions? Interesting sort of personal position here. I was a Christian when my wife of now miscarried. I was upset, of course, blamed myself for God wanting to punish us. I hope you don't mind me putting that up there. That's fascinating. And isn't that really telling of the psychology of religion again? Going back to, because I talked about this did I talk about in another video? I did a blog post on this about how getting God off the hook. Oh yeah, I did. So humans, we're to blame because Christians can't have God to blame, because obviously God is perfect. God cannot be culpable for anything. And because, as we've been talking about, God is clearly culpable for everything. But God can't be. So therefore, if a miscarriage happens, how can it be? Well, some other reason must be. Well, what other reason could there be? It can't just be some kind of random reason to do with like nature and things. So therefore, it must be a human reason. So therefore, and if this pregnancy is only to do with me and my wife, then and the pain and suffering of this miscarriage is going to be this happened before Oh, goodness me. Right, I know why that happened, and it won't happen next time because I know exactly why it happened. I have a dodgy connection on the USB. It's literally a dodgy connection. That is why that's happening. So that won't happen next time. I do apologise. I'm really, really sorry about that. I just want to do justice to Alan's point here. So when he is a Christian, he naturally, you're going to blame yourself. You're going to blame yourself or your wife or both of you because it just looks like a punishment to yourself. And God can't be responsible for anything that's bad. God cannot be responsible for anything that's bad. So therefore, all badness or suffering or evil is the responsibility of something else or someone else. Some people will go back in time and say it's Adam and Eve and the fall, and that's weird because you're exacting punishment on people thousands of years down the line. Other people will say, well, no, that's even though you find that in the Hebrew Bible, it's problematic. So the punishment must be for more of the here and now, and it must be Alan's fault or Alan's wife's fault or both of their fault. And of course, it's just psychologically damaging. It's so damaging. Anyway, thanks for that point. And finally, just before I sign off, philosophy and common sense should be held in higher regard over the biblical text. If the texts don't follow what is logically coherent, textual ideologies must be thrown out. That's a really, really interesting, important point. And of course, that's not what happens. So the Christian will say, this thing, I presuppose this is absolutely true, and it's coherent, and therefore that has primacy. And everything else has to fit that. So I will mentally contort in order to allow this to stand, or my faith to stand. And I will jump through hoops, and I will give up philosophy and common sense, and I will adhere to beliefs that defy philosophy and common sense in order that this thing, the Bible or my faith, maintains. It's really good point. Thanks for that, Dustin. And that's what happens too often, and that's why I do the work I do and say the things I say in order to try and give ammunition to people and to show them that hopefully that's not consistent. That's not what you should be doing. Anyway, I just want to say thank you so much. Sorry for the technical issues. I do know the problem, so that will not happen next time. I'm absolutely confident. So sorry that there was 2 or 3 times I cut out. Dagnamit, but hey ho, that's life. Thanks for checking out, and I might try this more often, but with more consistent technological expertise. Thanks a bundle, and eventually when the whole channel becomes monetized, when I get enough time, there'll even be stickers and stuff and all that kind of super chats, but do you know what, whatever, because it's more important that you guys are here and just you're getting something out of this, and I hopefully you do get something out of this, and it's quite nice to have this interaction. It's challenging for me because I have to try and when I, for example, have conversations with Derek from MythVision, Derek Lambert, of course, while I'm talking, he's then checking the comments. But when you're doing it on your own, I have to speak and then try and read while speaking. And then that means that sometimes there's a bit of dead air, maybe while I'm reading a question, and that's quite a difficult skill. So I obviously have to get a bit of training in there. But if I ever come to speak with other people and invite other people on, and maybe some of you, if you want to chat about belief or anything that we talk about in these videos and chats, then that might be easier for me to do. But in the meantime, bear with me. It's a learning curve. Hopefully, the video quality is at least better. I'm doing my interviews on Zoom at the moment, and it compresses the video quality to a really shite level. So I'm going to have to spend money, I think, eventually trying to get there's something like upgrading StreamYard or whatever it is to get a decent a video quality in my interviews, because it's such a shame, because there's such good content. I hope anyway. You'll let me know. But thank you so much. You take care. Big love to you all. And as I always say, question everything, particularly yourselves. And just, nothing like having videos just get stuck. So this is, what better way to finish this than on a technological issue. Take care. Thanks, guys.